The final door of the Greystone foundling home closed behind Ilara with a sound like a breaking bone. It was not a slam, but a quiet, oiled click that sealed 2 decades of her life away forever. She stood on the top step, a thin wool coat pulled tight against a wind that promised a bitter autumn, clutching a stiff manila envelope. Inside was a deed, a single, rust-pocked key, and $100 in worn bills. Her entire existence tallied and settled. Mr. Albright, the home's director, had called it a final kindness, a bequest from a great-uncle she had never known, a man whose name, Theron, was as foreign to her as the concept of family itself. The property was described in the solicitor's letter as unimproved, a delicate word for what Albright had bluntly termed a pile of rocks in the middle of nowhere. He had smiled a thin, pitying smile. It is, I'm afraid, all he had to leave. A fitting inheritance, perhaps. The unspoken words hung in the air, a worthless plot for a worthless girl. The journey to North Hollow was a descent. The bus groaned down winding mountain roads, leaving the last vestiges of manicured civilization behind, plunging into a wilderness of granite and pine that grew denser and darker with every mile. The other passengers, rough-faced men with calloused hands and weary women with tired eyes, glanced at her once and then looked away, her city-worn coat and pale face marking her as an outsider, a ghost already haunting their periphery. When the driver called out the name of the town, it was little more than a cluster of gray-board buildings huddled in a valley, a scar of settlement in an otherwise unbroken expanse of forest. The wind had a different voice here. It was not the channeled gust of city streets, but a vast, mournful howl that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains on its back. Ilara stepped off the bus, and the world seemed to shrink to the single dusty street, the looming peaks on all sides, and the bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She found the general store, its windows clouded with dust and time. The man behind the counter was old, his face a roadmap of hard seasons. He introduced himself as Elias Vance. When Ilara showed him the deed, his eyebrows, thick and white as frost, climbed his forehead. He polished his spectacles with a corner of his apron, squinting at the parchment as if it were a relic from a forgotten age. "Theron's Folly," he murmured, the name a local legend she was only just learning. "Thought the county would have seized that land for back taxes years ago. He was an odd one, your great-uncle. Always digging. Said he was listening to the mountain." Elias gave her a long, measuring look, his gaze lingering on her slender frame and the faint tremor in her hands. He drew a crude map on a piece of butcher paper, his pencil strokes thick and final. "It's a good 5-mile walk. Follow the old logging trace north. You'll see it when you get there. Or what's left of it." There was a note of grim warning in his voice, a hint of pity that was sharper and more genuine than Albright's. "Winter's coming on fast, girl. This isn't a place for games." The walk was a trial. The logging trace was overgrown, a faint suggestion of a path that clawed its way up the side of the valley. The air grew thinner, colder. The sun, already low in the sky, was a weak, watery disk that offered no warmth. Twice she stumbled, her thin shoes no match for the treacherous terrain of loose rock and slick pine needles. The forest floor was a graveyard of fallen giants, their moss-covered bones a testament to the brutal force of the seasons. By the time she saw it, her muscles were screaming, and despair was a cold knot in her stomach. A pile of rocks was a generous description. It was a wound in the hillside. A dilapidated stone facade, half collapsed, was set into the earth itself, more a cave entrance than a cottage. The roof was a tattered quilt of rotted timbers and fallen slate, gaping open to the gray sky. A single, skeletal birch tree stood sentinel beside it, its white branches like bleached bones, reaching for a sky that offered no comfort. This was not an inheritance, it was a grave. Ilara pushed open the heavy oak door, its groan echoing in the cavernous space beyond. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and something else, something wild and ancient. The interior was a single large room dug directly into the hillside. The back wall was raw, weeping stone. The floor was packed earth. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall, its chimney choked with debris. A crude table and a single chair, both hewn from massive logs, were the only furniture. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust and grime, a shroud spun by decades of neglect. She sank onto the dirt floor, the cold seeping through her coat, and for the first time since the Foundling home's door had clicked shut, she allowed the full weight of her desolation to crush her. Tears tracked clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She had nothing. She was nothing. The wind howled through the broken roof, a mocking laugh that echoed the hollowness inside her. She could walk back to town, use the last of her money for a bus ticket to nowhere, or she could lie here and let the cold take her. For a long, silent hour, the second option felt like the only mercy the world had left to offer. She stayed there as the light failed, a small, huddled shape in the growing dark. The paralysis of despair was a physical weight, pinning her to the cold earth. Her life unspooled in her mind, a succession of gray dormitories, thin blankets, and the careful, practiced invisibility required to survive a childhood without love. She had always been a ghost, drifting through rooms, leaving no trace. Theron's Folly felt like the end of that drift, the place where a ghost finally comes to rest. The cold was becoming a serious, biting thing now, no longer just a discomfort, but a predator stalking the edges of her consciousness. Her fingers were numb, her thoughts sluggish. And then, something broke through the fog. A flicker of movement in the deepest shadows of the hearth. A tiny field mouse, bold in the silence, scurried out, retrieved a fallen seed, and vanished back into the stone. It was such a small, insignificant thing, a creature of instinct and survival. But watching it, a different feeling began to curdle in the pit of her stomach, beneath the cold and the grief. It was anger, a hot, bitter rage against Albright, against the world that discarded people like herself, against the cosmic joke of this ruin being her final destination. It was not a grand, roaring fire of defiance, but a tiny, stubborn ember. The mouse was not giving up, and if a creature that small could fight for its life, then so could she. The anger gave her strength. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints protesting with a series of stiff cracks. Her first action was not one of grand strategy, but of simple, methodical labor. She would not freeze in a tomb of her own making. She started clearing the debris from the hearth. It was mindless, grueling work. Stones, dirt, ancient birds' nests, and the skeletal remains of small animals came tumbling down her hands. Soft and unused to such labor, were quickly scraped raw. Dust filled her lungs and caked her face. But with every armful of refuse she hauled outside, the despair loosened its grip. The rhythmic work was a balm, a physical mantra against the howling void of her thoughts. She was not planning for the winter. Not yet. She was simply cleaning her space, imposing a tiny sliver of order on the overwhelming chaos. She was acting, not being acted upon. It was a change, so fundamental, it felt like breathing after being held underwater. By the time she had cleared the flue enough to see a patch of starry sky, she was exhausted, filthy. But the ember of anger had grown into a steady, warming flame of resolve. Deep within the hearth, behind a loose stone at the very back, her fingers brushed against something that was not rock. It was wood, smooth and cool. Curiosity piqued, she worked the stone free. Behind it was a small, dark cavity. Reaching inside, her hand closed around a metal box, heavy and cold. She dragged it out into the faint moonlight, filtering through the broken roof. It was an old military footlocker, sealed with rust but otherwise intact. For a moment she was afraid to open it, afraid it would contain nothing but more dust, another cruel joke. But she forced the rusted clasps with a loose stone, the screech of metal a sharp cry in the silence. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed linen, was not gold or heirlooms, but something far more valuable. There was a thick, leather-bound journal, a set of drafting tools, several canvas rolls of detailed schematics, and a small, carefully wrapped oilskin pouch. She opened the journal. The handwriting was precise, angular, the ink faded, but still legible. The first entry was dated 40 years prior. "The fools in town call this my folly." It began. "They see a man digging a hole. They do not understand. I am not digging a hole. I am building a battery." Ilara spent the next 2 days devouring the journal, huddled in her thin coat, rationing the small amount of food she'd brought. Theron's words were a revelation. He was not a madman. He was a brilliant, self-taught engineer and naturalist, obsessed with the ancient science of thermal mass and passive heat exchange. He had chosen this specific spot on the mountain for a reason. The schematics detailed his design not for a house, but for what he called a katalofen, a massive masonry stove designed to burn a small amount of wood at extremely high temperatures, storing the heat in its dense ceramic mass and radiating it slowly and evenly for days. But the stove was only one part of the system. The house itself, the cave, as the town called it, was the other. Dug into a south-facing slope of dense granite, it was designed to be a thermal battery, absorbing the sun's energy during the day and drawing on the deep, stable warmth of the earth itself, a constant 55 degrees, year-round. The journal detailed the geology of the hillside, the angle of the winter sun, the prevailing wind patterns. It was a masterpiece of observation and applied physics. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the oilskin pouch. Inside were dozens of carefully preserved seeds. Theron's notes explained they were for a specific fast-growing species of willow he had cultivated, a coppicing variety that could be harvested for firewood every 3 years without killing the tree. He had planted a small, hidden copse in a sun-drenched hollow a quarter-mile from the house, but it was the other discovery that truly stunned her. The schematics showed hidden storage chambers, dug deep into the rock on either side of the main room, their entrances sealed behind cleverly disguised stone plugs. Theron wrote of insulating these chambers with the most effective material he knew: raw, unwashed sheep's wool. The natural lanolin, he explained, made it resistant to moisture and pests, and its tightly packed fibers created an almost perfect barrier against the cold. He had planned to live here, to prove his theories, but a sudden illness, mentioned in a final brief entry, had taken him before his work was complete. The house was a half-finished symphony, and she, Ilara, was the only one who had found the score. Her plan, born from the pages of her great-uncle's journal, would have sounded like pure madness to anyone in North Hollow. She would not fix the roof. Instead, she would complete the earth sheltering, covering the remaining structure with layers of sod and insulating wool, leaving only the south-facing stone facade and a few small, strategically placed windows exposed. She would finish the cacophon, a complex maze of heat-exchanging channels that snaked through a central masonry bench, and she would find the hidden chambers, hoping against hope that her great-uncle had had the foresight to stock them. It was an audacious, almost impossible task for one person, with winter breathing down her neck. But for the first time in her life, Ilara had a purpose. She was not just surviving, she was completing a legacy. She was taking the fitting inheritance of a ruin and proving it was, in fact, a work of genius. The next morning, she walked the 5 miles back to North Hollow, the journal tucked securely in her coat. She entered Elias Vance's store with a new look in her eye, a quiet fire that replaced the haunted, hollow gaze he had seen before. She laid a list on the counter: bags of fire clay and lime mortar, a heavy-duty shovel, a pickaxe, a length of steel pipe, and a large quantity of dried goods, flour, beans, salt, oil. It was a list that spoke of building, of staying, of preparing for a siege. Elias tallied the cost. It was nearly double the $100 she had. He looked at her list, then at her face. "This is a lot of gear, girl. What are you planning up there?" Ilara met his gaze without flinching. "I'm finishing my great-uncle's work," he sighed, a long, weary sound. "Theron's folly, child. That place is a death trap. The first big snow will collapse what's left of it. You need to be thinking about getting out, not digging in." She simply shook her head. "No." The single word was not defiant, but absolute. It held a certainty that unsettled him. As they were talking, the store's bell jingled. A large man entered, his frame filling the doorway. He was well dressed, for North Hollow, in a thick wool jacket and polished boots. His face was florid, his expression one of permanent unearned confidence. "Vance," he boomed, his voice overly loud for the small space. "I need those invoices for the lumber shipment." He noticed Ilara and her pile of supplies, and a smirk played on his lips. "Well, well. If it isn't the foundling, I'm Silas Croft, head of the town council." He didn't offer a hand. "Heard you took up residence at the old madman's burrow. Trying to what? Talk to the mountain like he did?" He gestured dismissively at her supplies. "Mortar and a shovel. Planning on burying yourself before the snow does it for you. It'd be tidier, I suppose." His laughter was a harsh, barking sound. Ilara felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm preparing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Croft laughed again, louder this time. "Preparing, girl! You can't prepare for a winter in these mountains with a sack of clay. That hovel will be your tomb. We'll be digging your body out come spring." He turned back to Elias, his condescension a palpable force in the room. "Don't extend her any credit, Vance. It's a bad investment." After Croft left, a heavy silence settled in the store. Ilara's hands were clenched into fists at her sides. Croft's mockery, meant to crush her, had instead solidified her resolve into something as hard and unyielding as granite. Elias Vance looked at her, then at the list, then back at her. He saw the fury and determination warring in her eyes. He had known Theron had thought him eccentric but harmless, and he had known Silas Croft his whole life, had always chafed at his arrogance. He made a decision. "He's a fool," Elias said, his voice a low grumble. "A loud, confident fool. They're the most dangerous kind." He slid the list back across the counter and began gathering the items. "Pay me for what you can. The rest is on credit. You can work it off in the spring." He paused, holding a bag of flour. "I still think you're crazy, girl. But I've learned one thing living up here. The mountain doesn't care much for loud, confident men. It respects stubbornness." It was not an endorsement, but it was a lifeline. It was the first crack in the wall of disbelief. The next 6 weeks were a blur of back-breaking labor, a race against the dying of the light. Each day, Ilara rose before dawn and worked until her muscles gave out, long after the sun had vanished behind the western ridge. The first task was finding the hidden chambers. Following the journal's cryptic clues, she located the 2 stone plugs, camouflaged flawlessly into the rock walls. It took her the better part of a day, with a pry bar and sheer willpower, to move the first one. Behind it was a space just as Theron had described, cool and dry. And it was stocked. Not with food, but with tools far superior to her own, preserved in greasecloth. There were also dozens of enormous, tightly bound bales of raw, greasy wool, smelling faintly of lanolin and sheep. The other chamber held Theron's woodpile, the fast-burning kindling, and the dense, slow-burning hardwood for the cackle-oven, all cut to size, stacked and seasoned to perfection over decades. It was a treasure beyond measure. The physical toll was immense. Her body, unaccustomed to such relentless toil, ached constantly. Her hands became a landscape of blisters that burst, bled, and hardened into calluses. She grew leaner, tougher. The softness of her former life burned away by sun, wind, and sheer effort. She excavated tons of earth and rock, reinforcing the roof with timbers she scavenged from the collapsed section, then layering it with the thick wool bales and heavy sod, creating an insulating barrier several feet thick. She looked less like a homesteader and more like a creature of the earth itself, constantly covered in a layer of dirt and sweat. She ate standing up, slept the dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted, and rose each morning to face the mountain again. She was in a constant conversation with the landscape, learning the language of stone, the heft of timber, the smell of coming rain. The centerpiece of her work was the stove. Following Theron's intricate diagrams, she rebuilt the firebox and the labyrinthine network of horizontal flues that snaked through a massive stone and clay bench that would dominate the center of the room. It was painstaking work, each fire brick and stone laid with care, each seam sealed with the lime mortar. She was no mason, but she was a meticulous student. She learned the feel of the mortar, the precise way to set a stone, so it would hold fast. The Kachelofen grew slowly, a monolithic beast of clay and rock, an altar to her ancestors' genius. It was ugly, functional, and, if Theron was right, the most efficient heating machine in the entire valley. While she worked, the seasons turned with brutal swiftness. The vibrant greens of late summer bled into the fiery oranges and reds of autumn, which in turn faded to the stark browns and grays of winter's approach. The wind grew teeth, and the first snows dusted the high peaks, a stark white warning of what was to come. One afternoon, as a biting wind tore the last of the leaves from the birch tree, a figure appeared on the path. It was Elias Vance, leading a mule laden with supplies. He stood for a long time, just looking at what she had done. The half-collapsed ruin was gone. In its place was a low green mound, a living part of the hillside, with only the stone facade and a few small, deep-set windows visible. A thin curl of smoke rose from a newly capped stone chimney. He looked at her, at the new hardness in her face and the quiet competence in her posture. "Fire!" He shook his head, a slow gesture of disbelief. "By the saints," he breathed, "you actually did it." He had brought more supplies on credit, a side of bacon, sacks of potatoes and onions, things she hadn't dared to ask for. "The talk in town is that you're dead already," he said. Unloading the mule, Croft's been making bets on which day the wolves will find you. Says your little project is an insult to common sense. Ilara simply nodded, checking the mortar on the new chimney cap. "Common sense is what you use when you don't have any other kind," she said, echoing a line from Theron's journal. Ilias looked from the solid, earth-covered dwelling to the massive, heat-radiating stove. She was just finishing. His doubt was being chipped away, replaced by a grudging, growing respect. He was still a skeptic, but he was becoming her ally. The harbinger arrived not as a whisper, but as a scream. The radio in Elias Vance's store, the town's only reliable link to the outside world, crackled with a static-laced warning from the State Weather Service. They called it a once-in-a-generation storm. A polar vortex displaced from its Arctic home was descending upon the region. It promised record-low temperatures, hurricane-force winds, and snowfall measured not in inches but in feet. The broadcast spoke of life-threatening conditions and urged everyone to prepare for prolonged power outages and impassable roads. In North Hollow, a frantic energy took hold. People boarded up windows, stocked up on firewood and kerosene, and checked the seals on their inefficient iron box stoves. Silas Croft, in his large, drafty house on the edge of town, laughed off the warnings. "A bit of snow," he declared at the store. "We're mountain folk. We've seen it all before." This panic is for city people. He bought a bottle of expensive whiskey and went home, confident in the brute force of his massive woodpile and the thickness of his walls. Ilara felt the storm's approach in her bones. The air grew unnaturally still, the sky taking on a strange bruised purple hue. The usual chorus of birds and insects fell silent, a profound and unnerving hush settling over the mountain. She did not panic. She performed her final preparations with a calm, methodical grace. She brought in the last of the seasoned willow from the covered woodshed. She checked the seals on her small, double-paned windows. She cooked a large pot of bean stew, the savory aroma filling her small, warm space. Her final act was to fire the cackalophin. She loaded the firebox with a precise amount of the fast-burning kindling and hardwood, just as Theron's journal instructed. The wood caught with a roar, the fire consuming the fuel with ferocious intensity for 2 hours. Then, as the wood turned to glowing coals, she sealed the airtight firebox door and the chimney flue, trapping all the heat within the stove's massive thermal core. The science was simple. The heat would now radiate out from the clay and stone mass for the next 24 hours, maintaining a steady, even temperature throughout the dwelling. There would be no more smoke, no more fire, only a silent, penetrating warmth. As the first flakes of snow, hard and granular as salt, began to fall, Ilara sat on the warm stone bench of the cachalophen, eating her stew, and listened to the rising wind. She was ready. The blizzard struck with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked like a banshee, a solid wall of sound and fury that seemed intent on tearing the world apart. The snow was not falling, but being driven horizontally, a blinding white torrent that erased the landscape in minutes. In North Hollow, the reality of the storm quickly dwarfed the forecast. The power went out almost immediately, plunging the town into a terrifying, windswept darkness. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 below zero. Iron stoves, meant to heat a single room, devoured wood at an alarming rate, yet they could not fight the insidious, life-sapping cold that poured through every crack and crevice of the old wooden houses. Families huddled together in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The wind, a relentless predator, clawed at their homes, shaking walls, rattling windows, and driving fine, stinging snow through the tiniest of gaps. Fear, as cold and sharp as the ice forming on the inside of their window panes, began to set in. In his large, well-built house, Silas Croft was losing his battle. His confidence had evaporated with the plunging mercury. The sheer volume of his house, once a source of pride, was now his enemy. He had to keep his massive fireplace roaring constantly, feeding it log after log, but the heat simply raced up the chimney, while the rest of the house grew dangerously cold. The wind found every imperfection in the construction, whistling through window frames and under doors. He was a prisoner in his own living room, a small island of flickering light, in a sea of profound, encroaching cold. His whiskey offered little comfort. He was burning through a week's worth of wood in a single night, and he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that it would not be enough. His arrogance was a poor shield against the raw power of the mountain, and for the first time in his life he felt small and afraid. The storm was not just a weather event, it was a judgment. Meanwhile, 5 miles up the mountain, inside Theron's Folly, there was silence. The fury of the blizzard was a distant, muted roar, the sound filtered and softened by the tons of earth and snow that now blanketed her home. The interior was an oasis of calm, steady warmth. The cachalophen radiated a gentle, pervasive heat that kept the entire space at a comfortable 68 degrees. The air was fresh and still. Ilara sat on the heated bench, reading one of her great-uncle's old engineering texts by the light of a single oil lamp. There were no drafts, no cold spots. The deep, stable temperature of the earth beneath her and the thick, woolen sod insulation above her created a perfect, self-regulating sanctuary. She had an abundance of food, a limitless supply of seasoned wood, and a shelter that was not fighting the storm, but had become a part of it. She was not just surviving, she was living, warm and safe. A silent testament to the triumph of quiet wisdom over brute force. She was a heart beating calmly in the frozen chest of the mountain. For 2 days and 3 nights the storm raged without cease. In town the situation grew desperate. Families ran out of firewood. Pipes froze and burst. Elias Vance, his store's generator, providing a single point of light and warmth, organized rescue efforts, bringing families from the coldest homes into the relative safety of his store and the town hall. He thought of the girl on the mountain. He felt a deep, gnawing guilt, certain that no one could have survived this storm up there, alone in that hole in the ground. He pictured her frozen, buried under 10 feet of snow, and his heart ached. Croft's cruel prediction had likely come true. When the storm finally broke, he resolved he and some of the other men would go up there. They would bring her body down. It was the least they could do. When the storm finally passed, it revealed a world transformed, a landscape of impossible, sculptural beauty and deadly peril. The sun shone from a brilliant blue sky onto a sea of white. North Hollow was buried. Snowdrifts reached the rooftops of single-story buildings. The silence was as profound as the storm's fury had been. It took the townsfolk a full day to dig themselves out, to create a network of narrow canyons through the snow that connected their homes. The damage was immense, the toll on their resources catastrophic. Silas Croft's house was a frozen shell, his prized whiskey bottles all burst in the cold. He emerged, haggard and humbled, his face etched with the shock of his near-fatal ordeal. He had survived, but his arrogance had not. When he heard Elias Vance gathering a party to go up the mountain to recover Ilara's body, he insisted on going. Perhaps it was a flicker of guilt, or perhaps he needed to see the final grim proof of his own conventional wisdom. The journey up the mountain was an expedition. It took 4 men, including Elias and Croft, half a day on snowshoes, to break a trail through the deep, powdery snow. The forest was an alien landscape of white mounds and burdened branches. As they approached the area of Theron's Folly, their steps slowed. They expected to find nothing but a featureless drift, the location of the hovel completely obscured. Instead, they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. A single, clear column of smoke was rising from a stone chimney into the still, frigid air. They stared, uncomprehending. It was impossible. No fire should be burning. No one could be alive. They trudged forward, their hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and disbelief. They reached the clearing and stood before the mound. The stone facade was mostly visible, swept clear by the prevailing winds, but the rest of the dwelling was just a gentle, snow-covered hillock, indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. The air coming from the chimney was warm. Elias, his face a mask of awe, approached the door and knocked. A moment later, the heavy door swung inward. Ilara stood there. She was not merely alive, she was thriving. She wore simple wool trousers and a shirt. Her cheeks were rosy with warmth, her expression calm and questioning. Behind her, the men could see the interior, bathed in a soft, warm light. The contrast between the deadly, brilliant white cold outside and the impossible, gentle warmth inside was a physical shock, a sensory blow that left them speechless. It was like peering from the heart of a glacier into a summer meadow. Ilara invited them in. They stumbled inside, shedding their snowshoes, their bodies instantly registering the profound comfort of the space. The air was warm, not the scorching dry heat of an iron stove, but a mild, pleasant warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stones around them. They saw the massive masonry bench, warm to the touch, and the neatly stacked provisions. There was no fire in the stove, only a faint glow deep within its sealed chamber. Croft, his face pale with shock and confusion, looked around wildly. How? He stammered, his voice hoarse. Your fire? Where is your fire? How are you not frozen? Ilara looked at the massive cacolophon, the heart of her home. She ran a hand over its warm clay surface. I fired it yesterday morning, she said simply. It will keep the house warm until tomorrow. She then gestured to the thick earth-covered walls. The mountain holds the summer's heat deep in its bones. You just have to know how to ask for it. Her explanation was not a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, a profound lesson in physics and humility delivered in 2 short sentences. In that moment, Silas Croft's entire worldview crumbled. Everything he had believed about strength, about progress, about the superiority of modern brute force methods was proven utterly wrong. He, with his large house and his massive woodpile, had nearly frozen to death. This young woman, this outcast he had mocked and condemned, had not only survived in a hole in the ground, she had done so with an effortless grace and efficiency that bordered on magic. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and for the first time he saw not a pathetic foundling, but a person of immense, unshakable power. The humiliation was total and absolute. He didn't say another word. He turned and stumbled back out into the blinding snow, a broken man stripped bare of his pride. He was never a force in the town again. The story of his near death and her impossible survival became a local legend, and he quietly sold his mill and moved away within the year, unable to bear the weight of his own foolishness. The story of the girl who had tamed the winter spread through North Hollow like a warming fire. Elias Vance, her first and most important convert, told everyone who would listen about the impossible warmth of her home, about the quiet genius of the madman Theron, and the stubborn resolve of his heir. The town's perception of Ilara shifted from pity and scorn to a deep and profound respect. She was no longer the outcast. She was the woman who understood the mountain. They began to seek her out, first for curiosity's sake, then for advice. They came with questions about their own drafty homes, their inefficient stoves, their dwindling woodpiles. They saw her not as a threat, but as a source of wisdom they had forgotten they needed. Ilara, in turn, did not hoard her great-uncle's knowledge. She had inherited not just a home, but a responsibility. She shared the principles from Theron's journal freely. She taught them how to build better insulated pantries, how to orient their homes to the sun, how to use the Earth's own thermal mass to their advantage. She showed them the schematics for the cacolophon, explaining how its slow, radiant heat was healthier and more efficient than the convection heat of their iron stoves. She became a teacher. Her voice, once quiet and hesitant, now carried the calm authority of lived experience. She did not lecture from a position of superiority, but shared her knowledge as a gift, a way to help the community that had once scorned her become stronger and more resilient. Over the next few years, North Hollow began to change. The transformation was slow, but steady. One by one, families began retrofitting their homes, adding insulation, ceiling drafts, and, in a few ambitious cases, building their own, smaller versions of Theron's masonry stove. They learned to work with the environment, not against it. They planted their own coppices of the fast-growing willow. The town, once defined by its brute force struggle against the harshness of the seasons, began to find a more harmonious rhythm with the world around it. The winters were still long and cold, but they were no longer a terror. The community, bound by this shared project of rediscovery, became more self-sufficient, more tightly knit, and less reliant on the fragile promises of the outside world. Decades passed. Ilara remained in her home on the mountain, a quiet, respected elder in the community she had reshaped. Theron's Folly was no longer a name spoken with derision, but with reverence. It was a landmark, a school, a living museum to a forgotten way of thinking. Children who had grown up in warm, efficient homes would visit her, and she would show them her great-uncle's journals, explaining the simple, elegant science that had saved her and, in turn, saved their town. Her legacy was not written in stone monuments or grand buildings, but in the quiet confidence of a community that had learned to face the winter without fear, in the smoke that rose from efficient chimneys, and in the deep, abiding warmth of homes that had learned to listen to the mountain. In the end, the story of Theron's folly became a parable for something much larger. It served as a timeless reminder that the most valuable wisdom is often not found in the loudest voices or the most popular opinions, but in the quiet, dusty corners of the world, in the forgotten journals of supposed madmen, and in the stubborn, resilient heart of a single individual who refuses to be broken. It teaches that true strength is not the power to dominate nature, but the wisdom to understand and harmonize with it. It is a testament to the idea that what society deems worthless may hold the key to survival, and that the most profound solutions are often whispered by the earth itself, waiting for someone with the patience and humility to listen.